started. Thank you all for coming to this special Earth Day event. We have Christopher Joyce from National Public Radio. He's a science correspondent. He's been nice enough to spend half the day with us here at Penn State. This talk is part of the broader Earth Day events at Penn State, and it's sponsored by the Penn State Institutes for Energy and the Environment, and also the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences Earth and Environmental Systems Institute. Now, Christopher Joyce, you've probably heard his voice ring through. His stories have been part of NPR's news desk coverage, from anything Morning Edition to All Things Considered to Weekend Edition as well. He covers on science and also on the environment, anything from the discovery of colorful dinosaur feathers to the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy to tracking scientists in the Amazon who are setting fires to understand the linkages with climate change. In addition, he's written a couple of books on general science topics: Witnesses from the Grave, The Stories Bones Tell, and Earthly Goods, Medicine Hunting in the Rainforest. Before joining NPR, he was also a science reporter and editor at the British weekly New Scientist, and he's received several awards, including the Columbia University Journalism Award and also the Association for the Advancement of Science Excellence in Journalism Award. And we're very lucky to have him here with us today, and I'm sure it'll be an illuminating and entertaining view on how scientists and journalists need each other to tell better stories about our planet. So please join me in welcoming Christopher Joyce from National Public Radio.
Jennifer, as you may have guessed, the person I was chasing around the Amazon was Jennifer. It was the first time I met Jennifer, and she was a grad student, and I had a fabulous time in the Amazon with her because she was given the job of, God, would somebody take the journalist and get him out of our hair, please? And she was sort of the field managing as well as being a postdoc from Yale School of Forestry. And so she dragged me off into the far regions where I couldn't get in trouble. And then we had a lot of fun, and I interviewed her, and she was nervous at first, but not for long. And then she took me to show me something. It was this phenomenon that puzzled her. It was these little trails in the forest, little tiny trails like 3/4 of an inch wide. And she got me to bend over and take a look, and these were leafcutter ants. And the leafcutter ants, I don't know if you know much about them, but they make these trails through the forest, and they go for miles and miles and miles. And she found a nest for me. I mean, it was fabulous. And I had a great time. And only now, I think, what was it, 7 years later, she told me that she actually has published a paper on the phenomenon of these ants actually making fire breaks. And I went to her at lunch today and said, "Who was I named as a co-author?" And she just kind of laughed. No, we're not co-authors, we're codependent. I'll get this that way, okay. I guess I picked that topic because, I've been a science journalist. Before that, I was a political journalist in Washington, and I got my fill of that pretty quickly. You spend a few years covering Congress when you want to run from the building, tearing your hair and falling on the ground and biting sticks, which is what I did. And when I got up, I decided what else could I do in journalism that would be hanging around people who are interested in what I'm interested in, which is finding out the truth. I wasn't interested in science. I didn't know squat about science. But it seemed as if that was where the people were who were trying to track down the truth. I thought, well, that sounds like a fine bunch to be with. And so I met a couple of people from New Scientist magazine at the AAAS meeting. I flagged them with lots of beer, with the last amount of money that I had since I was unemployed at the time, but I figured it was a good risk. And sure enough, they hired me on at New Scientist, that's a weekly British magazine, and I worked there for 10 years as the US correspondent, and then went to NPR after that, after writing a couple of books, and finding out that books are fun, but they don't pay a lot, particularly if you write about science, unless you're a Nobel Prize winner or something. But in any case, I do a lot of this. I talk with scientists all the time. As a journalist, I interview them in order to tell the stories that I tell. But I do these visits a lot too, and I do science training for scientists who are interested in communicating. I usually work with the Aldo Leopold Fellowship. We take a bunch of scientists and put them in a room for 3 days and deprive them of everything that they need, and force them to do mock interviews. In the evening, we work them over dinner, we ply them with wine, mock interviews again. Jennifer's been through it, all in the idea that eventually they'll come out communicating a little better. And to us, that's important as journalists because we can't tell stories without you. I'm not trained in science, and I couldn't, for the life of me, do the kind of work that's necessary to really understand science. So I have to talk to people like you. And I guess you're here because, well, I guess if it weren't for NPR, you wouldn't be here. So I'll tell you a little about NPR. We are surviving fairly well, as the rest of the mainstream media does not. We have quite a few. We have about 15 people on the science desk. That includes medicine, environment, hard sciences, biology, whatever. I tend to do a lot of biology, environment, ecology, forensics, all the dead people, all the dead stuff, paleontology, paleoanthropology, dinosaurs, whatever else, whatever happens, hurricanes, earthquakes. I don't know why these are the things that I do, but that's the way it's come. They won't let me handle people, like medicine and that sort of thing, so I handle bones a lot. We're doing fairly well. Hopefully we'll continue to do well. And actually we could take a little poll here. Who owns a radio here? Raise your hand, you own a radio. That's pretty good. Oh, hold on, keep your hand up if you own a radio. I own a radio, okay. Everybody over 30, put your hand down. Oh, if you're over 30, put your hand. All right, if you're, okay, even if you're 20. So, okay, I don't see, that's the future, see, and that's one of the things we're worried about in the media is that radio may not be the medium that it used to be in the future. That doesn't mean that audio storytelling is over. Hopefully we'll still tell the same stories, but they'll just be listened to through a computer or through an iPhone or an iPad or whatever gadget people are using 10 or 15 years from now. And I must say it's very reassuring to see that I don't see any iPhones out right now. They're all being hidden. But this is the way we're going to try to reach people. But again, the rules of reaching people, the lay public, with what you do, remain pretty much the same. They have to understand you. And scientists and the lay public are divided by this language, English, and the language that you use is not the language that the rest of us use. And of course, I can say the same thing to lawyers, I can say the same thing to accountants, and to journalists too. We all have our argot, we have our way of saying things to each other that makes it very easy to communicate. But when we try to cross that divide, it can be rather difficult. One of the things I like to do is, and if I can get this to work, is that I like to play some interview, I call them outtakes, that are pieces of interviews that we've done, and to illustrate sort of what we face as journalists trying to translate what scientists have discovered into something not only that's intelligible, but interesting too, because our job is we have to hold the person's interest. It's so easy just to say, I don't like that, I can push the button and listen to some old rock and roll. And so I'll play a couple of outtakes here. One is from an interview that one of our reporters, David Kestenbaum, had to do the morning of the Nobels. When the Nobel was awarded, and this is one of the big jobs, is to call the Nobel winner as fast as you can, because that person is going to be inundated with phone calls all day long. And you've got to get in there and get your 30 seconds of tape and your description, and you only have maybe just one or two questions you have time to ask because they're just overwhelmed. So David, who actually has a PhD in physics, this is a physics Nobel Award, quite capable of understanding sophisticated scientific principles, called up the Nobel Prize winner, and this is a bit of the conversation.
Could you just describe, and speak up if you can, describe as simply as you can your contribution, what you're getting the Nobel Prize for?
The citation is for the theoretical work I did in connection with the new phases of liquid helium-3, which were discovered experimentally in the early 70s. The experimental work has, in fact, received a Nobel Prize to Osherov, Richardson and Lee, that I think was in 1996. What I did was basically to take the existing theory of superconductivity as developed by John Baldini and his co-workers here at UIUC and apply it in a somewhat more sophisticated form to the new phases of helium-3, assuming that basically what was happening in superfluid helium-3 was much the same as is happening in superconductors, namely that you find pairs of particles coming together to form a sort of diatomic molecule, and that diatomic molecule then undergoes a funny kind of transition in which all the molecules have to behave in exactly the same way.
Okay, you have that? Yeah. Now, I mean, absolutely no disrespect to this gentleman. He did well win the Nobel Prize in Physics. I don't think I can match that. But in terms of trying to describe what he does in a nutshell, and as I said earlier to Jennifer's class, David Kesselbaum, with a PhD in physics from Harvard, could well have followed it, but he couldn't put that in the radio piece. He ended up using one piece of tape from the interview, which was, Professor, how do you plan to spend the money? And the answer to that was in there. So, you know, this is what we have to do, and this is the raw material. Now, not everybody, of course, I mean, physics is pretty tough. Biology is a lot easier to deal with, and environmental science is easier to deal with too, but I'm going to play another cut where you'll find that, I mean, even something fairly simple can be difficult to get across in a punchy way. This is a situation where an NPR reporter was doing a story about West Nile virus in Washington. And the concern was zoos with their animals might be reservoirs for infection. Nina, don't give away the end here. She heard it before. And so the idea was John was going to go over and find out from the biologists at the zoo, is this truly a problem? Is this something people should be worried about? And he wasn't getting the answer that he needed, so he took desperate measures.
I guess the important statement that we want people to understand is that zoos are part of the community in which they exist, and that community either has risk or does not have risk, and there's no difference within the zoo boundaries than with outside the zoo boundaries. So we actually are...
Oh, you didn't say that right. The community, just do that again, that was great though. I mean, no, here look, I told you this already, but I'm at the end of the bar, I'm really drunk. I want you to make this point, I want you to hold my interest, but I am a real dumb shit, and I'm gonna fall and get a hematoma if you don't give this to me. So, and I'm convinced that I'm gonna die if I go to the zoo, okay? If I go to the zoo, I'm gonna die, buddy. I don't care who you are, so you tell me, you got 10 seconds to tell me why I don't have to worry about the zoos.
Zoos are not any different than the surrounding area in which they exist. There's no reason to believe that coming inside a zoo wall presents a greater risk than being outside the zoo walls. They're part of the community in which they exist. The animals here are just as susceptible as the people, and it's a citywide or a region-wide thing, not a specific hotspot.
How do you know that?
We know that because we test our animals a lot. We test for mosquitoes, we look for mosquitoes. We actually do more surveillance inside the zoo than the cities do or the counties do outside the zoo. So we actually know our risk much more than say, another part of the city.
And it's low.
And it's very low, yeah. Nice.
See, I'm helping you, it's media training.
That's right.
John doesn't work with us anymore. He's gone the way of all journalists. John was a genius. I mean, I can't say that I would have done quite the same thing myself. You may have noticed he got results. He got a very punchy, powerful response that was to the point, and as important as being succinct, it was also emotional. I mean, I think he, kind of wired him up a little bit. And not that I'm recommending that journalists, get scientists pissed off in order to get them to be emotional, which would be nice because it's very important to show your enthusiasm to the lay public. We have this notion that scientists are these sort of robots, and it's not true. But language and this sort of scientific practice of being objective and showing that objectivity all the time out front tends to alienate a lot of the lay public. They don't understand. They think that, well, people are different from me, and that's not necessarily true. But in any case, now there are some scientists that we interview who are, ready to go off the shelf. I mean, they know how to tell a story. They know how to use metaphor, analogy, all the things that we love, and that make for describing complex things in simple ways. And as I've said earlier this afternoon, I don't think there are any ideas scientifically that are too complex for people, anybody. There's only language that's too complex for people. And so this is a case of a scientist who is describing a rather, a rather arcane phenomenon that happens on asteroids. It has to do with the polarization, I guess, of the spin of asteroids in the asteroid belt. But he uses no jargon, without any prompting. This is not my interview, somebody else interviewed him. And it's just a lovely little story that's colorful and important in radio and in broadcast and others, where we want people to create an image in the listener's mind. Radio is actually a visual medium. And I might play a story if there's time later to try to show you that, is that we want to create a little movie in your head. And this scientist does that very nicely.
Well, the important thing to recall is that asteroids are in the asteroid belt, and everyone has in their picture of their mind of, let's say, the movie The Empire Strikes Back, where spaceships are careening through the asteroid belt and are always in danger of blowing up. But in reality, the asteroid belt is very sparsely populated, and so asteroids hit each other very, very infrequently. So they can sit there for hundreds of millions to billions of years, and except for a few smaller collisions, in many cases they aren't affected in a major way by collisions. So what can happen is, over this time, sunlight can land on the surface. Sunlight is always landing on the surface of these asteroids, and it's slowly heating them up in much the same manner that sunlight heats up the sidewalk. And anyone who's walked on the sidewalk knows as the sidewalk gets hot, it's radiating a lot of heat. Well, as asteroids radiate this heat, it causes a small little push on the asteroid. And over time, it's going to cause the asteroids to actually change their spins. If you're willing to wait millions, in this case, as long as billions of years, this could have a very important effect on how the asteroid's spin is changing and how its north pole is pointing.
Okay, there's not a piece of jargon in there. And The Empire Strikes Back, I saw that. A piece of hot pavement on a summer day. All of that's very visual. And for the layperson, they don't need to know methodology. They don't need to know, the statistical probability of this being the case or how often. I mean, just the basic idea. I mean, this is all you need to get across. And this is one of the things that I often find difficult for scientists to accept, is that, you look at a scientific paper and it's all front-loaded with methodology and with, as that first Nobel Prize winner mentioned, well, it's not me, it's Bardeen, it's somebody in 1938 did this, and then somebody in 1928 did this, and somebody in 57 did this. That's all playing to your peers. That's all playing to, oh, I'm not a personality, I'm not egotistical, I'm just part of this big family, and we all stick together, and I don't want to stick out now. And I'm sorry, that doesn't play. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize. I want to know what he did. So that's important to remember. Another thing that's very difficult in this codependent relationship is, and I'm sure you've had this if you've talked to the media, is getting across uncertainty. Because uncertainty is a big deal in science, and if you get out ahead of yourself, your peers, again, will nail you. Even though the public may not know the difference. I mean, it can get very difficult for people to describe.
I suspect the answer will be we still can't put any number on with really great confidence. I think what we feel, what people will feel, or the general consensus in the community now is the number won't be as large, or the limit on the size of the number is not it's not an unbounded limit, I guess I'm trying to say. We don't understand the number, but we think the number will be less than what we thought we didn't understand before.
I'm curious.
I love that. Poor guy. I mean, he's trying. That wasn't me doing the interview with Richard Harris, but it's like I felt like saying, let's skip that part. It's okay. I mean, it's enough for me to say, science a scientific group at X university suspects that this is the case. I don't need to know the bounds of uncertainty. And I know that I hear from a lot of scientists who say, well, I mean, oh, people want to know, is this really going to happen or it really isn't? And they don't like caveats, they don't like shades of gray. I don't find that. I think that people can deal with uncertainty, the lay persons can deal with uncertainty, as long as they're upfront about it and saying that, you know, I've often used the phrase, we don't know the final answer yet, but it looks like this, or this preliminary evidence suggests that, and I think most of the public is quite happy to deal with it. But again, you know, this is a part of this relationship that we need to cultivate between us, so that you don't fear people like me who you think may be looking for you know, a gotcha story or something that must lay out things in black and white. I don't think most of us really want that. We just simply want a good tale, a good story about something that people are going to be interested in, either because it's cool, this is a gee whiz kind of story, or because it's relevant. Like, you know, I mean, I remember, and this goes back a ways, I learned more about the human colon when Ronald Reagan had his colonoscopy or a colon operation than I ever wanted to know, because it's a story that, you know, something like that happens, or the explosion in West Texas, and they come running to the science desk and say, what's anhydrous ammonia? What's ammonium nitrate? What's it made of? Are there after effects? Are there combustion products that might cause pollution afterwards? Will it infect the ground? Will it contaminate the groundwater? So you get called in to play off of breaking stories. Another thing that's really nice to have from scientists is just to share your enthusiasm. I mean, I'm pretty sure, having done this for science journalism for 30 years, that most of you, if not all of you, you really get up in the morning looking forward to what you do. You know, you love science. You do it because you love it. Because it doesn't pay a lot. It's a lot of work. Spend a lot of time in a horrible lab, I'll bet, some of you, staring down the barrel of a microscope or looking into a petri dish. We can't all go lighting fires in the Amazon, you know. It's not all fun and games for everybody. And so, you know, you were the top of your class, you could have made a lot of money being a lawyer or an accountant or something, you know, movie star. But you chose science because you love it. And you got to share that with people, because it humanizes you. Again, there is this notion that scientists are this other kind of breed. You know, that's a smart-ass kid in class who always made A's and was a teacher's pet. And they went off to MIT, and good riddance, because, you know, I'm a cool guy and I sell cars and I'm having a good time, and I don't really care about those people anymore. They made me feel intimidated. And there's nothing better than showing how much you love what you do to get both the journalist and the people I talk to engaged. So I'll play one more piece of one more interview from a woman who, she was a graduate student at the time, and she had gone to Florida. She was studying otoliths and bird anatomy and hearing. And she got dragooned into helping some people with gators, because they were studying alligators. And just because she was a student and a biologist, and she said, okay, I'll go with you. And she got incorporated into this team. And she noticed something when she was up close and personal with the alligator, about these pits that were in the alligator's nose and around its face. And because she's simply an inquisitive human being, she said, what are these things? And nobody knew. And so she changed her major, and she started studying this. And she started collecting gators in the University of Maryland lab. And in the end, she found the answer, and she had a cover paper in Nature before she got a PhD, or I think she just got a PhD. And I love the interview with her because she exudes all the things I think that's in science that doesn't come across a lot of the time. Enthusiasm, the wonder, and serendipity. So, play Gator Girl.
How this all came about to you, because you said you were studying birds.
Yes.
What were you doing messing around with gators?
And this is actually a fun story, because it was my first day out in the field, and we went out in the field and they were collecting gators for blood samples and a variety of other things. And we're coming back, and there was this big gator on the back of this truck, and I was sitting on it.
This is your first time?
This is my first time. So I was sitting on top of it, and there are other people around, you know, we're all trying to keep the gator down and going back to the lab with this large animal. He must have been maybe 7, 8 feet. He was, you know, he was a decent size to me, at least.
Bigger than you.
Bigger than me. maybe a little bit bigger than me, and we're going back, and it was very exciting. Somebody was driving way too fast on that road, I can tell you that. And then it's amazing when you start paying attention to the animal you're working with, and you're just looking at it, and seeing what it looks like, and morphology, and I looked at its face, and I thought, gee, what are these little dots all over the place? And so I came back to the lab, and I did a big literature search, and I looked to see if anybody had studied them. What is this? Just out of plain scientific curiosity.
Out of plain scientific curiosity.
Yeah, this is
I love that. And she was so full of enthusiasm. She said, well, look, this is a story. It was an interesting story. And immediately all the hair on the back of my head stood up because, tell stories. Tell a story. Because that's what people want to listen to. I mean, storytelling is older than prostitution. And it is the oldest profession. It's around the campfire, right? It's around the campfire. What happened to Grandpa in the big drought, okay? He found water over there. Let me tell you the story. And because it's useful, I hand that on to you. Maybe we put it to rhyme and then you remember it. That's what it's all about. And so she knew that instinctively. She just, it's a story. And I can watch you listen, and you're there with her. And that's, there's no reason that a scientist can't do that any less than a politician or an economist dealing with the media, because that's what we want. We just want good, most of us just want good stories. 1 out of 100 wants to nail you or something, but, we'll talk about climate change in a minute. But in any case, so those are some outtakes that sort of give you an inside look at the raw material that we use. One other thing I wanted to mention while I'm talking to people who are in academia and who are practicing science and are going to practice science when they graduate is that, the rules are changing really fast. And since I'm going to retire in a few years, I don't really care that much. That's okay. I think the rules can change. But for the rest of the media, we're seeing our lives change a lot. That's going to mean some differences for you as potential communicators of science. There are fewer of us to tell your stories for you. The media that you have at your beck and call, Twitter, Facebook, blogs, allows you to go straight to the consumer, much more than you could have 20 or 30 years ago. I really recommend, I know like nobody has any extra time, especially if you're trying to get a scientific education. But I really recommend learning these tools of the trade, the cyber trade, because they give you the opportunity to tell people what you do, and lots of scientists are doing it. I just had a couple of beers about a month ago with a woman who does a blog called SciCurious, which is part of the website at Scientific American. Terrific. She's a neuroscientist at Penn. She's 27 or 28, completely cyber literate, digital literate, and she does all of it, Twitter and Facebook, and very facile. And she has a tremendous following. And, people are interested in science. They just need to be able to find it from people who can speak their language. And SciCurious, which is her pen name, knows how to do it. In fact, I hope we hire her sometime. So I think, let's see, I sort of free associated for half an hour. That's not bad. No, I actually have to do my notes. See if I missed anything. Yeah, I guess I could talk a little bit about, along those lines, not only about how we in the media sort of subdivide science stories, but if you are interested in getting into it yourself, how you might consider, okay, what is it that I do that could possibly be interesting? I spend 10 hours a day hunched over, a microscope and, or, waiting around in a swamp somewhere collecting microorganisms or plankton from the Chesapeake Bay. Scientists, by the nature of the business, kind of subdivide things into small bits, so you all attack them, and then you produce data is everything or everything. And then hopefully somewhere down the line, somebody interprets it and it coalesces into an idea about how the world works. But it's a slow process. And of course, as storytellers, we can't wait around for the end necessarily. But when you think about what you do and why people might be interested in it, think big. Think the big picture. There was a great movie made a few years ago, well, more than a few, called The Player, and it's about producers in Hollywood. And there's this great scene where a screenwriter comes into a producer's office. And producers are famously thick, slow, and they're very patient, and they have maybe 2 minutes. And so as a screenwriter, you wait years to get your 2 minutes with the producer. It's a great scene because the screenwriter has to lay out this complex movie in 2 minutes, or less, or when it gets thrown out. That, in essence, is what you have to do to communicate what you do with the public. Is you've got to think, what's the big picture here? How is my work related to something that's going to change the world? If it has to do with the mix of parasites in somebody's body who's infected with a malaria parasite, maybe you're thinking about the parasite's chemistry, but the story is interesting to the lay public because it's about malaria that kills millions of people, and it's about this bizarre relationship between our bodies and all these little things that live in us. When the stories about all those bacteria and how biodiverse we are because of all the things that live on us and in us. People love that stuff. So find a way to think of where your work fits in the larger questions that are being asked and answered about science, how the world works. As I said before, we do a lot of reporting that is related to events, but then there are also, the public loves stories that are what I call gee whiz. In Morning Edition, and I don't know how many of you listen to NPR or Morning Edition, but there's a drumbeat of this is going on in Iraq, and the marathon bombings, or political stories from Washington, or economic news that's very depressing. A lot of it's a downer. And sometimes the executive editor of Morning Edition would come to the science desk, and she just looked so plaintive. And she'd say, would you give us 3 minutes of joy? 3 minutes of joy. Take us away from this drumbeat. And the science desk is where people get that, the arts desk and the science desk. Because you have things that are asteroids that all rotate in the same direction. What? How? How does that happen? How about, the thermos? It keeps hot things hot, but it keeps cold things cold. How's that? Come on. We have you have this door into this world of wonder and amazement, from Hubble Space Telescope to the goings-on inside, a malaria parasite. The weirdness of fig wasps, and how what makes a parasite lethal or not lethal, depending on the health of its host. There are all sorts of these intricate things of nature, and I've had the editor of the Foreign Desk. I did a story once about a spider in Costa Rica that it's a wasp that parasitizes a spider, so that the adult wasp lays its eggs in the spider, and the spider's the neurons in the spider change. And we use a different web, and you can recognize the web. It looks different if it's a parasitized spider. And the way that the web is woven actually helps the offspring of the wasp survive inside the spider and then burst out and escape without being caught in the web. And the foreign editor came over after me, and he's dealing with Iraq, every day. And he goes, isn't nature wonderful? And that's what you guys have. You've got the door into that. And so just don't talk like a Nobel Prize winning physicist, then people listen. We have some time. I know people like to ask questions, and I'm happy to answer them. We could do that now, or I could play a story that I did about climate and the big fires in the Southwest as an example of some of these things that I'm trying to get across. And if you don't, it's about 5.5 minutes. Is that cool? Yeah? Especially those people of you who don't have radios anymore, who missed it. There's a series I did about the megafires last year in the Southwest, and whether or not there was enough of a trend to be able to say that this we were seeing this is a cause and effect of climate change. Over a series of 5 stories, I tried to make that point. But I found that the scientists were very passionate, and that it was a story that got a fair amount of attention.
This is the archaeology of
No, that's not it.
The mountain forests of the Southwest are burning. Over the past 2 decades, fires have been setting new records for size and intensity. NPR's Christopher Joyce reports now on what's causing these mega fires and how they're changing the face of the Southwest.
Fire scientists are calling it the new normal, a time of fires so big and hot that no one can remember anything like it. One of the scientists who coined that term is Craig Allen. I drive with him to New Mexico's Bandelier National Monument, where he works with the U.S. Geological Survey. We take a dirt road up into the Jemez Mountains, into a landscape of black holes, as far as you can see, except that they aren't holes. Every single tree is dead.
For miles. Yeah, you can tell me the next time you see a green tree. I'd like to know the next time you see a live tree.
This is the Santa Fe National Forest. It's been hammered by fire numerous times since 1996. Last year's Los Conches fire outdid all of them, though. It was the biggest ever in New Mexico since records have been kept. We stop at a high rocky ridge. Alan jumps out of the car. He's an edgy, active guy with a bowl of brown hair, and he can talk for hours about trees. We walk to the edge.
We're looking here at a 800-foot deep canyon with steep canyon walls.
For thousands of years, these mountains have been open forest, mostly grass and ponderosa pines, a distinctive giant with the bark the color of whole wheat toast and a spray of needles at the top.
What kept those forests open before was the natural process of fire.
Natural fires from lightning burn along the ground, taking out only the shrubs and small trees. But for the last century, the U.S. Forest Service has suppressed almost all fires. They thought fire did more harm than good. The result is the blackened mange below us. More black poles out to the horizon. It was so intense it reached up into the crowns of these trees and wiped them out.
The heat of the fire creates a convection columns. They look like an atom bomb going off, actually. They go up until they hit the stratosphere layer often and flatten out, anvil-shaped like that. But that convection, as the hot air rises, it's pulling in at the surface more oxygen, which is feeding the fire.
Alan takes me to a meadow to show me what's grown since the last 3 big fires.
This has gone from being a forest for, we think, probably many thousands of years, a ponderosa pine forest, to shrubs.
For how long?
Indefinitely.
And those shrubs just make the next fire burn even faster and hotter. These fires affect people as well, and not just homes and vacation cabins in the woods. At the visitor center at the Bandelier Monument, the staff is busy trying to stave off flooding. Last year's fire stripped the vegetation from steep hillsides. Then the summer monsoon rolled in and flash floods cascaded down the slopes. Bandelier Chief Ranger Tom Betts says a swollen stream almost flooded the park headquarters.
It was only about a half an inch of rain, and on a non-fire landscape, we probably wouldn't even have seen much of a rise. As it was, you can see it came up in this area about 3.5 feet.
Today, Alan and Betts are figuring out how to deal with the next one.
High water and flood, what does that trigger in terms of management response?
The flood triggers shutting down any more visitor access.
Floods also threaten to wash away the artifacts left here by the Pueblo Indians who lived in caves in these canyon walls. The Forest Service has changed its long-standing policy of no fires. They realized that the fuel buildup was dangerous. Now they let some burn and start controlled fires to clear out that fuel. They also cut and remove smaller trees. But Alan says they're way, way behind. There will be more big, unstoppable fires.
Nobody is suppressing an active running crown fire. Okay, it's almost political theater, with air tankers at that point. Air tankers can help and fire retardant at the margins.
But burning embers from big fires leap across those margins and travel for miles. Alan has been studying the Santa Fe forest for 30 years. He feels personally responsible.
This is the part of the world I know best. And
do you think it's changed forever?
Well, from a human standpoint, yes. Even without climate change in the mix, this is probably not coming back as the forests and woodlands that they were before. It's hard to argue that we didn't fail.
And climate change is likely to make success even more difficult to achieve. Christopher Joyce, NPR News.
And NPR.
Thanks for listening. I found Craig very moving. It's pretty rare when you find a scientist who look at you in the eye and say, it's hard to say if we didn't fail. And yet that made the story so much more powerful, I think, in that it's a desperate situation, and it's a very difficult situation. And so many of the other stories went on to look at some of the data that suggests that it is a change in what they call vapor pressure deficit and the intensity of heat and the length of the droughts. And they've looked back historically at tree rings to see whether these megafires existed before and didn't, or they're extremely rare. And to see the periodicity frequency increase over years looking at tree rings. So there's a lot of interesting work going on, and people need to know. So let's have questions.
Thanks, Bert.
If I can remember.
And I can
Make it
speak
short.
loudly. I need to listen to your reports a lot of the time by podcast. I subscribe to podcasts because I'm not home at the time when the radio is going.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that as a model for the future?
Okay.
Based on radio, you talked about radio.
Right. So the question is, people listen via podcasts instead of the traditional way of waiting around till 4 p.m. for all things considered, and they can just, like cafeteria style, get it. Yes. I don't know whether it will be a podcast. We do podcasts. There's a science podcast. Planet Money has one. I mean, we have a lot of them. The question is doing the metrics, trying to figure out, when people download them, do they really listen to them? Or do they just download them? I mean, that's an unknowable, or it's difficult to find out. And we can't be sure that it's a wave of the future unless we know that they're really, you download them and then you say, I haven't got the time, forget it. And so that, we've got to figure that out. And the other thing is, podcasts are one way of packaging, but they still are sort of dictatorial in the sense that, well, I decide what goes in the podcast. Okay, somebody at NPR says, okay, we'll take that story, these 4 stories, and then put them in the podcast. Whereas we want maybe a model that says, I'm a listener, I have an iPhone or an iPad, I'm interested in, let me see what the menu is. I'm interested in forest fires, I'm interested in Hubble Space Telescope, I'm interested in how my 401k is doing, and so what's going on with the market today. And they can pick. And that's not a podcast, necessarily a podcast setup. So we're still struggling with that. Questions? There must be. Come on. Sir, and with the glasses.
Maybe you can weigh in on a debate in my family. I've got 2 kids that are...
She's right.
I've got 2 kids in different parts of the national media. And the debate is whether or not the evening news will still be with us in 10 years. Where do you come down on that?
I'm going to quote, I think it was Einstein, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. Heck if I know. I mean, I will admit, I do not watch the evening news. Now, that's for various reasons. One is that I work late and have a long commute. So I listen to the radio or I listen to music. Secondly, I've kind of given up on the evening news. I prefer to get my information from the New York Times, the Washington Post, from the New Yorker. I mean, everybody's got their own favorites. And TV news, sorry. I mean, I've been to too many events where there was a television crew, and I was there too, and I watched what they put on the TV, and I went, that's not what I saw. And so I would predict it will be there, but I think, their numbers are going down pretty bad. I mean, our numbers are going down too, but not as bad. Newspapers are going down. There could be television news, but you should notice that the way that the broadcast media is going is with TV is 24/7. So it's not segmented like, oh, come on, Grandma, it's 5 o'clock, let's go watch the evening news. It's like whatever you want. So it's a different cycle. So it'll be different. Sir.
Chris, I'd like to have you imagine that you're a geologist.
I almost...
And imagine that you're an expert on fracking. Given the polarization of the debate over fracking, how would you, in 30 seconds or less, characterize the process without turning off either side of this fracking debate?
Okay. I've been in science journalism for 30 years, and controversy is always great in news because that's what makes people listen. You know, when a dog bites a man, nobody cares. I have never seen more scientific disinformation bandied about on any topic in my life as fracking. And I have spent a fair amount of time talking to people who are academics, who are in industry, who are in environmental groups, and I am amazed at the level of both inadvertent and purposeful disinformation. It's one of the hardest things I've ever had to cover because there is such an agenda on everybody's mind that it's gone really haywire. And it's so hard to get good, straight answers because everybody's out way ahead of the peer-reviewed work or work that I would consider a peer review, you know, of that quality. Unfortunately, as is often the case, an industry has gotten out way far ahead of the scientific community, but that does happen. And my 30 seconds are up. I'll take another 40, another 15. I think when you think about fracking, you cannot think of it in a vacuum. When you think about natural gas, you have to think about what it's displacing. What is natural gas displacing? 170 coal-fired power plants have been closed down in the past 5 years, more or less. Coal is the biggest source of carbon emissions on the planet. So is the glass half full or is it half empty? Sorry.
It seems to take an NPR reporter about a week of what I presume is hard work to get a 5-minute story out. How are you spending that time?
It depends on the story. There have been stories that I've done in 30 minutes, but that's not pleasant. And when the earthquake hit the East Coast in Virginia a couple years ago, I had to go on the air within a minute. On the other hand, sometimes I get 2 or 3 weeks. I've been working a week and a half on a story about Jamestown colony in Virginia going to disappear by the end of the century because of sea level rise. And I'm going to work 2 weeks on that. Long story short, you know, if you have a fair amount of time, if you have like 3 days, it's typical, 2 days maybe. I get a journal article, something like that, or if something happens that's interesting, I call 3 or 4 scientists who are involved in it. I call maybe it's an environmental group that may be affected, or a citizens group, a politician, something like that. I try to talk to 5 or 6 or 7 people. I spend a few hours reading up on the topic, which Google makes very easy for me now. I gather an hour or an hour and a half of taped interviews, 2 hours maybe. I pick and choose the parts that are not like the Nobel Prize winner, but are more like Lady with the Gator. And I piece together a story that makes sense, that has sort of an intellectual structure, as a flow, where you ask a question and then you answer it, and then so answering it, you ask another question, so you carry the listener through. And then I put them all together on the computer, and I write my story. My narrated part is the tissue, or the buttons, or the zipper, or whatever, that connects all those sound bites. Because the sound bites are what makes it true, not me. I'm not the expert. I just tell the story. And then when it's done, my editor looks over my shoulder, says, "It's crap, go back and do it again." And I do that for another hour or 2, and then I go into a studio and I voice it, and then somebody, producers, just puts the sound bites together with my voice, and then hopefully, sometimes within the next 5 minutes, it goes on the air. Sometimes it's right up to the minute, depends if it's a daily breaking story or a feature.
When you're not responding to an immediate emergency to do a science story related to it, how do you pick your scientists to interview?
Yeah, okay, so I haven't been repeating the questions. How do I pick my stories? Or how do they pick me? it's haphazard. I mean, sometimes I look at the journals, several journals every week. So that's kind of the low-hanging fruit. So if there's something interesting, but I've always got something working. So well, one was a newspaper article I saw in the Richmond Times-Dispatch about Jamestown going under, and I've been doing a lot of stories about Boston and New York after post-Sandy and what sea level rise means. It could be coming to a place like this and meeting this lady here and discovering that she knows far more than I do about hurricane insurance, which I'm very interested in because of the way that climate's going to change the way that the resilience of coastal cities. It could be talking to somebody at a cocktail party or my school or where my kids go, or it comes from all over the place. And I also have built up a large catalog of people, scientists, who sometimes they'll call me and say there's something going on. I cover fracking. Rob Jackson, I talk to Rob Jackson all the time, because he's just one of those people who seems to be in there, but less agenda driven than me.
Last one.
What are your suggestions for scientists who want to become better communicators?
Okay, so that's a great question, and that's why I'm here, really. Thank you for getting to the important part. The question is, what's my advice for people who want to communicate, and they're trained as scientists and not as communicators? Read a lot of non-scientific material, and hopefully you've been doing that. I don't care if it's fiction, non-fiction, poetry's good. Just get a feel for the language. Listen and read what you can find that's popularly written science, to see what's out there and see how people do that. Try practicing things, try thinking about what you do and say it, go talk to your aunt or go talk to your best friend and say, I have to describe what I do in 30 seconds or less, and make that person interested. And then get it down to 20, and then get it down to 10, and keep doing that. Think about analogies and metaphors all the time about what you do. And like the guy with the asteroid, he said, oh, remember Empire Strikes Back, and it's like a hot pavement when the sun heats it up. Those are beautiful similes and metaphors to give a visual image of what you're talking about. Erase every little bit of jargon you can from the language you use when you're talking to not to your peers, but to others. And most of all, when some gnarly old ancient professor who should be retired looks at you and says, why are you wasting your time out of the lab talking to the public about this? Give him a good kick in the ass.
Thank you. All the gnarly old professors, watch your back. So I wanted to thank all the people who organised the event today at PSIE and at EASY. And thank you all for coming, and most of all, thank Chris.
My pleasure. Don't take my job. Take it. Please.